Howdy everyone! Today we are painting up two Borderlands Skags from the exciting new Borderlands game Kickstarter from Monster Fight Club. We're going to do a big one, and then if you stay tuned till the end, we'll get a baby Skag pup done too. To get these Skags started, we primed the models black and then hit them with a light gray primer. I feel like that gives a little bit better coverage, kind of a little bit better stick-to-itness than just using the light gray primer by itself. And then once the primer's dried, we're going to hit it up with a thin layer of Nuln Oil Gloss from Citadel. The gloss paint runs into the cracks and crevices a little bit more, leaving the raised areas lighter than its non-glossy version. And just kind of get that all over with a nice, thick, messy, crusty old brush. And that's going to help create some of the deepest, darkest shadows to start with. With a coat of Nuln Oil Gloss all over, we're now going to get a wet brush that doesn't have any paint on it. We're just going to use that damp, kind of clean brush to wipe off some of the Nuln Oil from the top of the figure. That's going to lighten up the top of the figure, effectively giving you a little head start on the highlights. We'll add some sharper highlights later on, but this is a quick and easy way to just end up with a figure that's a little darker on the bottom and a little lighter on top. Taking it one step further, you can even dab at the top of it with a clean paper towel, and that'll give you a nice little kind of gradient to start out with, where the top of the miniature, kind of top third of the miniature, isn't quite as shaded by the Nuln Oil as the bottom 2/3 of the miniature. So let me just grab a Skag here that I've got primed up that hasn't been washed with Nuln Oil, and you can kind of see a side by side, which is useful sometimes if you haven't done this before. And you can kind of see the effect that we're getting with the Nuln Oil. So you're starting from a white, and you're ending up with something that's more of a light gray with dark cracks and crevices. And kind of looking at it side by side, you can darken up the bottom even a little bit more, kind of boost that contrast up even a little more extreme. And then while the Nuln Oil is drying, we're going to grab a pot of the Citadel texture paint. It's a Grelin Earth. This is one of the crackle paints. I think the crackle effect is going to be a nice match with the Borderlands universe. The way the crackle texture paints work is the thicker a layer you put on, the more cracks and the bigger cracks that you'll get. So if you want nice big cracks, glob it on. They really want kind of some bumps and thick parts to the texture paint. And for the best effect, I think you want to have some layers that are a little thicker and some areas that are a little thinner, not a thin, even coat like you would with paint on the miniature. But you want to have a little variety. You almost want a little bit of that Ripley look you see here, where there's varying thicknesses of this texture paint that have been applied. It's a water-based paint, so cleanup is quick and easy. So next step, we're going to add some brighter highlights before we start putting any color on. One of the things, if you want to get some miniatures done quickly, if you've only got 15-20 minutes to paint, is to do things in drying order. Try to do the things that take longer to dry first. So you can notice on the base here, the texture paint is still wet while I'm putting on the white highlights. And as long as you're careful not to touch it, it's fine. You can actually even see, as we speed up the time here, you can see the thinner areas of the texture paint starting to crackle as it dries while I'm painting it. Don't be afraid to put paint on one part of the miniature while another part of the miniature is drying. If you're trying to paint fast and you have a ceiling fan in your room, it can sometimes help to turn that on and reduce the drying time a little bit. You just want to be careful on that if you're trying to do any blending or anything, not to have it dry too quickly. So we've got some bright white highlights now on the raised parts of its scales, and it's time to add some color. So starting with the Citadel Contrast Snakebite Leather, today I'm going for a very traditional, basic Skag color scheme, sort of Skags that you're running and gunning down throughout the Borderlands worlds. One of the advantages of using a contrast paint over a really extremely high contrast base coat here, you're going to get more dramatic highlights and shadows under the contrast paint. And with this, we're basically done once we put the contrast paint on. When I do contrast paint over a flat base layer, I find that I often end up wanting to go back in and either shade it a little bit more or highlight it a little bit more afterwards. And doing it this way, with the highlights and the shading first and the contrast paints on top, I find it a little quicker, a little more natural way to paint. Some people will do this version of this with an airbrush, something called zenithal highlighting, where you spray the miniature from above with white. But I think the hand-painted highlights and shadows are a better fit for the Borderlands art style. So you end up with something like that. You can see you've already got a nice highlights and shading on the brown. And then for the grays on the scaly plates on top, we're going to go with the Citadel Contrast Basilicanum Gray. I'm going to dilute that down on the palette with a little bit of contrast medium. I think the Basilicanum Gray can be sometimes a little harsh. I just want to start with something a little bit lighter, and then I'll grab a little bit more of the pure Basilicanum Gray as the scales go down. Now with the highlights that we painted on, these scales are a fairly bright white, so you could just go in with just a pure Basilicanum Gray. That'd be fine too. So I wandered out of frame here, so I'm just going to skip forward a minute. All we've done here is put on the gray throughout the scales. And that's looking pretty good. You've got a nice rocky, scaly look to that. I'm liking how the skin looks. Now, at this step, you could totally stop here, call this mini done. But I'd like to add one more layer of kind of interest and color on the skin. So I'm going to go in and pick out some of the raised areas of the skin the skin area, the leathery brown skin, with a pure white. And then we're going to go back in later and add a layer of Skeleton Horde, which is a lighter brown contrast paint, to all of those areas that we just highlighted with white. We're using this straight out of the bottle. Dries really fast. The white I'm using is the bold titanium white from Monument Hobbies Pro April range. So with those white highlights and the Skeleton Horde to darken them up a little bit, it's just kind of one more level of sharp highlights on the skin. Now that the gray has dried on the scales, we'll go in, put a little more gray on the scales to just further shade that up. So again, you could have stopped earlier, but one more layer of color and highlighting. I prefer that look, but that's up to you. Whatever works for you. These are your miniatures. And as a final detail step here, we're going to go in and pick out the claws and the jaws. And these are really fun miniatures to paint. I'm really liking how well they take washes, how easy it is with the tip of a brush to pick out the raised details. It is not hard to get these miniatures tabletop ready and looking good in 20-ish minutes a miniature. Before I edited the footage from today, before I sped it up, we were looking at about 25 minutes start to finish to paint both this larger adult Skag and also the Skag pup. So 25 minutes for 2 miniatures. Even with as many miniatures as come with the game, it wouldn't take that long to bang these out and have a really awesome looking table of fully painted miniatures. All right, we're in the super fast last stages here. We're going to put a dot of red on both eyes, and I'm intentionally putting on a little bit of a thick, a micro blob, so to speak, of red on the eyes. And then I'm going to quickly go in before that red has a chance to dry and just dab, dab, dab in the center of the eye with a little bit of white, trying to get a slight effect to kind of blend the white in with the red in the center. This is a little hit or miss. Sometimes it works better than others, but it is a way to lighten up the red in the middle of the eye while the red paint is still wet and give those Skags the glowing red eyes that we all know and love. All right, with that done, the next step is going to be to grab some Citadel Agrax Earthshade. We're not using this all over the miniature, but I do want to hit those teeth and claws with a little bit of the Agrax Earthshade just to dull them down just a little bit, make them not quite so glaringly bright white. Super fast. Because the skin's brown, if you end up getting a little bit of this on the feet, doesn't matter at all. So just kind of whack those claws and jaws with a little bit of the Earthshade. I'm kind of smudging a little bit in and around the scales too to give it a little bit of that smudgy Borderlands look. Then I'm going to grab a big fat brush and wash the entire cracked texture base with the Agrax Earthshade. Just make sure that the texture paint is fully dry before you wash it with anything. Otherwise, you're going to have a mess on your hands. All right, and then once the Agrax Earthshade has dried, we're going to grab a little bit of ivory and go back in and do a little highlight on the jaws and claws again. It may seem like we're going back and forth a lot between highlights and washes, and that's true. You can kind of go the classic GW starting from dark and going up. But I find that going back and forth a little bit between highlighting and shading kind of gives you an opportunity to see what's working on the miniature, see what maybe needs a little boost, and you're not done with anything until you're happy with it. There's no problem to go back in and darken something up if you think it's a little too bright, or brighten something up if you think it's a little bit too dark. See what's working for you, and you'll get a sense of what you like and what looks good to you. It's a little more forgiving way to paint. And again, in that vein, you could stop after the ivory, but as a final touch, I'm just going to go back in, and on the very tippy tips of its toes, I'm going to give it a tiny little pure white highlight just to draw your eye to those claws that are trying to rip your face off. This is the final painting step before basing the miniature, and it's a good time to just, give it a look over, see if there's any parts you're unhappy with, see if there's anything you want to go back and change or touch up before going on and doing the basing. I think it's satisfying to make the base the last thing you do, but you can certainly do that in another order too. For the base, the Agrax Earthshade on the texture has fully dried. We're going to grab a big fat dry brush and some Steel Legion Drab from Citadel. I use Pro Acryl's paints for most things, but man, this is such a good color. It's just a really nice, neutral, kind of dark khaki color. Works well for the edges of bases. It works well as a dry brush over most browns for kind of an earthy brown. And again, saving time here, just go ahead and edge the base with your dry brush since you've got that in your hand. Then I'm going to grab some ivory that was still wet on my palette from the previous highlight step, mix that in with the Steel Legion Drab, just kind of mixing it on the paper towel there. Wipe it mostly off on the paper towel, which give you just a little bit of paint left on the bristles to dry brush the texture. Dry brushing the crack texture will just kind of help the edges of the cracks pop a little bit more and provide a little bit more visual interest on the base. I think it looks good if you kind of try to drag the bristles along the rounded edge of the base to kind of draw a little visual circle around the base and separate the top of the base from the sides of the base. Pop a little more Steel Legion Drab along the edges to clean that up after the dry brushing. And this bad boy is ready to go. Bonus Skag Pup! I wanted the Skag Pup to be a little bit lighter in color than the adult, so starting from the gray primer that we had with the adult, I put on a layer of Skeleton Horde contrast, and now I'm going to go back in with the same snakebite leather and darken some of the areas that are lower down on the miniature. This is a little bit different than what I did with the adult, but using washes and under highlights in this way is a very flexible and easy way to paint. So if you're familiar with miniature painting, you might notice that I'm using a Winsor Newton Series 7 brush to do my washes. These are often considered to be high-end, nice brushes. And I've got a few that I have had for years and I love, but I accidentally ordered the short bristled ones. They are not awesome. These are a relatively new brush, and they've already been relegated to washes duty. I would not recommend the short bristled Winsor Newton rounds for miniature painting. So with that aside, out of the way, I'm just kind of putting in a little bit of snakebite leather on some of the lower parts of the legs and the belly of this Skag pup here, just to darken it up a little bit. I'm not going to put gray on the scales. Going to try to tell the story that this Skag pup is young and immature and kind of hasn't developed its hardened, scaly exterior top yet. That's it. These are super fun to paint. I'm already looking forward to doing more. And finishing touch, we're back with some Tajima 1 yellow grass tufts. We're going to pop one of these on each of the bases just to break up the ground texture a little bit. I think the grass tufts are one of the easiest things you can do. They're not expensive to dress up your bases a little bit. One pack of these will last for an army's worth of miniatures practically. And that's it. Got a pair of good-looking Skags here, ready to do their worst against the Vault Hunters. And again, thanks to my friends at Monster Fight Club for hooking me up with some miniatures. Go check out their Kickstarter if you haven't already. There's a lot of cool stuff happening there, especially as it enters its final week. Thanks for joining us today. You've heard it before, but it really does help when you subscribe to the channel. Leave any comments or questions below. We've got more Borderlands miniatures on the painting desk. They'll be coming up soon, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching.